these guys?
Illithid.
Cthulhu?
Illithid. Or Mind Flayer.
Mind
Yeah.
Flayer?
Illithid.
That's why a Mind Flayer would be a good, like...
For recording.
Oh, what?
I'll edit it.
Okay.
Let's just start. Film some random chat.
Alright,
Listen
cool.
to Jack go.
Now we've all done that.
Alright, welcome back. In this episode, we're going to look at checks and ability scores. So, the first thing to start off with is what are your ability checks and what do all these values mean? So, these are all things off of the character sheets. So as you start creating a character, which we'll talk about in a later video, these things are all going to pop up. So firstly, let's talk about what they all mean, starting with your left column. So your main attributes.
Yeah, so when we create our characters a bit later, all these columns are going to have numbers in them, and also different modifiers. But right now we're just talking about what that means. So we've got this really handy picture on the screen here. So strength is the ability to crush a tomato. It's what it says on the tin. Dexterity is like being shifty, moving out of the way. Ability to dodge a tomato. Constitution is like what your health is based on. It's resisting poisons and things like that. And then intelligence is obviously you're smart, whereas wisdom, I think those ones are pretty self-explanatory. Charisma is like your persuasion, your talking skills, that sort of stuff. That's basically what they are. Different spells and different attacks will use different saving throws and different modifiers for what they are, depending on what you're doing. Most of the melee attacks are going to be strength and dex.
When we talk about numbers and modifiers, so you'll have a certain number of points, I suppose, that you can spend on your different abilities. And then your modifier is when I roll a d20, what number can I add to what I rolled?
Yeah, exactly.
So where would we see, if this is our character sheet here, this is the aspect of all like the things we just talked about, and then these are the more specific aspects. You're going to have your modifier in this square, is that right?
That's correct.
So this will be like a plus something, or it may be a negative something, and that's what Jack is talking about. You would add or subtract whatever the number is on top of your roll based on what you want to do.
And that small circle is where that raw score is going to go.
Yeah, so your strength value or score will go here, and the modifier, how much you add or subtract to your dice, will go in this box. And we'll cover that more when we talk about building a character.
Exactly right.
Just on the intelligence and wisdom, how would you sort of distinguish the difference between those two? Like in a maybe a role play scenario, when would I use an intelligence roll versus a wisdom roll?
Yeah, so intelligence I would probably use for trying to... I mean, the skills sort of next to that sort of that help determine that.
Oh, so these things here are what breaks it into.
Exactly.
So your intelligence is like an investigation, a
or
nature.
Like your history, like it's your knowledge, your base knowledge.
Right.
Whereas wisdom is more of that understanding and trying to spot
So
things.
when we talk about checks in a minute, that's actually going to be more specific to these rather than say do a constitution check. It'd more be like one of these that actually uses constitution.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
Excellent.
So while we're talking about this this section of the character sheet, inspiration is something that the DM gives out that most of you will not get that or have that, so you can pretty much just ignore that. Your proficiency bonus there is determined by your level. So in the player's handbook, every few levels, that'll bump up a bit and get higher as you go.
Right. So assuming that all of your characters are on the same level, as most DMs will sort of level you up at the same time, everyone's proficiency bonus is going to be the same.
Yeah, exactly.
Excellent. All right, so we mentioned about the main abilities down this side. Now if we look at these, which are sort of your skills and what you use a lot more for checks, let's talk about what they mean and more specifically when you would use them in scenarios.
Sure. So, you know what? Let's just quickly go over each of them because that's just going to be quicker.
Great.
So, acrobatics is like, I want to do a flip. It's pretty self-explanatory. Animal handling is like trying to interact with like animals, like trying to drive a horse, like direct a horse or tame an animal, driving horses. Yeah. I love those horse powers. Stuff like that. Arcana is like trying to understand your magic stuff. So like if you find this artifact or whatever, you can do an Arcana check to try and figure out what sort of magic it is, that kind of thing. Athletics is your things like climbing, swimming, that sort of stuff.
So acrobatics maybe is like, can you do a flip or land a roll, whereas athletics is how far you can jump.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly
Cool.
right. Yeah, and so, depending on what it is, you often DMs will say you can do an acrobatics or athletics check. Sometimes it's
So just for an example of that, like what you said, Jack, if you were trying to jump from one building to another, that would be athletics. Is that
If
right?
it was a far distance. for
If it's
sure.
a long distance,
Yeah.
you're looking at like athletic power.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're like, I'm going to jump from this building and try and do like a parkour roll, that would then become an acrobatics check to say,
absolutely.
do you take some damage or do you pull it off and look really cool?
Yeah, exactly right.
Great.
Yeah. Deception, I mean, that's pretty self-explanatory. It's lying. And then history, again, a lot of them are self-explanatory. History is obviously, like if you know about a certain artifact or a person that you've encountered or something like that. Insight is like trying to see if somebody's lying. So if you're suspecting that they may not be telling the truth or you don't necessarily trust them, you'd make an insight check.
So can you use insight, to my understanding, as well, to try and get a gauge of a person's intentions or whether they're good or evil, that kind of stuff? You can do like an insight check. This person seems shady.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, what do I feel about their vibe? Sort of stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Good vibes.
Intimidation, again, like for when you want to be intimidating. Exactly.
Scaring people into stuff.
Exactly. Like, similar. It's similar to persuasion in the way that you're trying to get something. It's just how you go about it. Investigation is like searching for or trying to figure something out. Like, say if you've got a puzzle box and you're trying to figure out how that works or something, you can make an investigation check.
Excellent. As well as we mentioned in an earlier video, just trying to find something. So if you're at the town, you're like, hey, I want to go find a blacksmith, and you might roll an investigation check. And if it's particularly low, the DM may say, for whatever reason, you didn't find anything.
Also, it's used for finding traps on chests.
Yeah, very important.
Yeah.
Traps.
Yeah. Now, medicine is not healing. So if you're making a medicine check, it's like trying to figure out how long a corpse has been dead, trying to figure out what killed them, or like how you can apply like bandages and things like that. It's not like I'm going to do a medicine check and they're going to come back to, like, they're going to get hit points.
What about, say, if you wanted to identify whether something was a poison or not? Is that a medicine check as well?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. You can get things like if you're proficient in like a medicine kit, like a first aid kit, you can stabilize people and things like that. But it's still not bringing back health points, hit points, and stuff like that. Nature's pretty self-explanatory as well. Like if you're trying to figure out like a certain plant or like where you are or like that sort of stuff, it's not used for tracking. That comes from survival, which is a bit later on. Perception checks is like I'm looking in the room and I want to see if there's anything interesting in this room, so I'm going to make a perception check, or like in the forest or anything like that. That's what that's for.
So on the perception, a lot of the time too, it'll either be, hey, I'm looking, like maybe I'm on a lookout overnight or something like that, but a lot of the time the perception is prompted by the DM.
Yeah,
He'll say,
absolutely.
I want you to make a perception check, and he'll use that to gauge whether you see something coming up or whether you're oblivious to the world around you, that kind of stuff. Yeah.
And each character also has what's called a passive perception. So like if things are happening around them, if the character's passive perception is high enough, they may just see that anyway.
Yeah. And again, that's more the DM. He'll keep track of that and say, oh, because of your passive perception, you've seen this without you needing to roll.
Exactly right. Performance is like if you're playing a bard and you want to play for a tavern, if you want to sing a song, but it could also be really anything. Like if you're trying to write this like super fancy letter, that sort of stuff. It's just if you're performing, that's performance.
Excellent.
Yeah. Persuasion, again, it's similar to that intimidation stuff, but you're trying to convince them without making them angry, basically, or scared.
Or, as we said before, it's like the good version of deception. You're not trying to trick them, you're trying to just genuinely convince them of something.
Exactly.
Charm.
Charm,
Charm,
yeah.
Religion, don't use that one a lot, but it's basically like if you're like a cleric or like a character that would have an understanding of religion, you might notice or understand what, if you see a certain symbol of a deity or something, you might know what that deity is and what that means.
Like a paladin as well.
A paladin as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sleight of hand is stealing stuff. Also often used for disabling traps and things like that, unlocking doors, that kind of thing. It's
Magic tricks.
It's that shifty stuff.
Yep.
If you're trying to cast a spell without someone noticing, you can do a sleight of hand check as well. And then stealth is stealth, like you're being sneaky.
Being undetected,
Yeah. And I'm not sure if it's cut off. But
Yeah, it is cut off, so just below that is our survival.
Yeah. And that's the one you use for, like, if you're trying to track something or you're in the wild and you want to forage for food, you would use your survival skill.
Or you want to find your way.
Or you find your way, yeah, of course. Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Alright, so there are ability scores and skills. So then when we talk about a check, so a DM may prompt you to do a check. And again, it's easier if you just, as the player, you just focus on, this thing's popped into my head, I want to do it. As I mentioned earlier, say, I want to jump from this roof to this roof. Your DM is then going to say, I want you to roll this check. So, Dylan, this is your avenue. So, for example, I say, I want to jump 14 feet from this roof to this roof. What's your response going to be to me?
I'm jumping out a window!
Don't, but make an athletics check for me.
Okay.
And then he'd roll, and then whatever that number comes up on the dice, you add to the number that will be on your sheet.
So I'd find athletics. This number here is going to be my modifier.
Yeah.
Let's say it's like a +1.
Yeah.
Jack rolls
A 10, so that would
a
be
10.
an 11.
So I add the 1. My athletics check is 11.
Yeah.
Then the DM will then decide. So he has sort of in his mind an idea of how hard the task is.
Yeah.
And then he sometimes uses a table that says if it's particularly hard, you need this number or higher to achieve it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so he'll then dictate whether you succeed or fail and how gloriously you do either of those based on that check. So it's really just, you say the DM, I want to do this. He'll prompt you on which check you need. So you don't even need to know what those checks are. Yeah. That's the DM's job to tell you what to check.
And you wouldn't even say, like, I want to do an insight check or I want to do a perception check. You would be like, is this person lying to me? And then the DM will say, make an insight check.
Exactly.
Or I walk into the room, I want to look around and see if I notice anything. Make a perception check. So,
and sometimes you can sort of question the DM or try and tweak it to a specific attribute. So you might be,
absolutely,
say your intelligence or your investigation is very high, but your perception is not, for example. You might say, well, rather than like, oh, do I notice anything, which is clearly a perception, you might say, I want to look around and can I specifically investigate the room or something like that. And so you're trying to prompt the DM that you're trying to investigate rather than look around.
Absolutely.
And whether or not you succeed or fail would probably depend on your in real life persuasion. So it's like, it's like, oh, but could I possibly investigate?
Yeah, and that's not to say like, I've got really poor acrobatics, but I'm going to try and tweak it and say, oh, well, I'm going to use a lot of strength to just land this huge fall. That's not how it works. It's more like if you are trying to be specific on, like, I want to do an investigation or a history rather than an arcana check, for example.
Yeah.
You're focusing your question around that attribute rather than
how
saying...
you phrase it.
Yeah, it's all in the phrasing. I'm not saying try and cheat the system.
And there's some stuff where it's just... It's evident that is what the check is, and you're not going to change the DM's mind. Like,
exactly.
Like Ross jumping 14 stories.
Yeah, it's not going to happen. So the last thing to talk about in terms of ability checks, skills, things like that is using tools and proficiencies. So Jack mentioned earlier about having a proficiency in something and how you add that to it. So Jack, do you want to talk to us about what a proficiency is and what you do with it?
Sure. So when you create your character, you will choose a whole bunch of things, but ultimately you will have your character sheet, which is this column that we've got up on the left here. Well, that's right on the camera. The left here. And say you are a barbarian, so they're very strong. So you might be proficient in athletics. So when you want to do things, you might try and play to your strengths. So proficiency is I might have a strength modifier of +3,
It should be up here.
It should be
Plus
up there. So anytime I try and do something that requires strength, I get to add +3 to my roll. If I am proficient in athletics, then, and let's say my proficiency bonus is +2, then I go, well, my strength score is +3, my proficiency bonus is +2, so I want to make an athletics check. Bam, I'll add +5 to the roll.
Yeah.
So just on that, on your character sheet, which we'll talk about later, if you're proficient, these little circles would be coloured in.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
for the athletics check that we're talking about, this would be a black circle so that you know you're proficient.
Yeah.
And then you add this proficiency bonus. So you see the black circle, you add this number to whatever the main characteristic, so strength, as Jack's saying, and that gives you a total bonus to your roll.
Yeah.
So if that's the proficiencies, which is basically just an
What you
attribute
are
of
good at.
Yeah, what you're good at based on your character or your race or class, etc. What about using tools? How do tools factor